AM560theanswer.com, on the AM560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. James Hankins is one of the last of the Mohicans in the Ivy League. Just an outstanding intellectual, history professor at Harvard. He writes in a recent op-ed with some advice and counsel for the new House Republican majority, and I like the idea. He writes, if you look at conservative media these days, a constant theme is how you're not allowed to say things anymore. They, quote-unquote, won't let you. You'll be deplatformed, canceled, fired. You can't challenge progressive orthodoxies about climate change or fossil fuels. You can't question the teaching of gender ideology or anti-racism in public schools. Students are afraid to push back against professors. Employees don't want to tangle with HR departments over politicized mission statements. You can't contest the conduct of tech companies or the FBI. Many people now sense the progressive left has a hammerlock on public opinion through its control of most media, the universities, Hollywood, and the DI apparatus of every large company. Decisions are made that degrade the quality of life for the little guy whose voice can't be heard. So, what could House Republicans do? Hankins writes, what if the new House were to challenge the information oligarchy by holding televised debates in the House that address the very questions the little guy is, quote-unquote, not allowed to raise? I don't mean members of the House should themselves debate these questions. Anybody who has watched congressmen debate before cameras in empty chambers knows that such an exercise would have no effect. I mean the House should sponsor its own chamber formal evening debates, Oxford Union style, on questions of public concern. What should be done about climate change? How can government best support the middle and lower income families? How can government strengthen the family? Should government regulate social media? If so, how? Bring in Joel Kotkin, the great academic from Chapman University who's written a book I've recommended many times, The Coming Neo-Feudalism, to talk about middle-income families. Bjorn Lomborg, our friend, to talk from the Copenhagen Consensus Institute, to talk about climate policy. Mary Eberstadt on family policy. Jonathan Haidt on social media. Let Democrats nominate progressives to represent their point of view. Let's have a real debate on issues that affect the American people. Let the American people once and for all, for once, I should say, hear all sides. Yeah, and importantly, hear them side by side. So whether Oxford Union style or, firing line style, the Bill Buckley version of firing line, not this ghastly bastardization of it that's on now. I love the idea. You got to make arguments. You have to make arguments. And particularly in the age of social media, this is great content to be sliced and diced and distributed and bandied about on social media, argued about on social media. Good. I have confidence in some of those intellects that Professor Hankins mentioned. See how much confidence the left has in their intellects. Where's their modern-day John Kenneth Galbraith? Does such a person exist anymore? I think that'd be really interesting. And it's about time to do some things that, break from the customary way of adjudicating public policy fights. And, frankly, do it in an unfiltered way such that it's more difficult for the D.C. press corps to spin to comport to their selected narratives. What do you think? Let's ask another intellect, Peter Berkowitz. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, former director of policy planning at the State Department. His writings are posted at peterberkowitz.com. Peter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
What about Professor Hankins's little firing line, Oxford Union-style debate idea?
I love the idea. It reminds me actually of how the Federalist Society, great organization, originally created by students, actually shot to influence within the academy, the legal academy. They hit on this idea the Academy was excluding, as you were suggesting, as Professor Hankin has suggested, conservative voices. But it was difficult for the Academy, the Legal Academy, to resist the Federalist Society's proposal to hold debates. Now, to hold a debate, even the law schools had to acknowledge back then that you needed a representative of, let's say, the progressive point of view. I could say the established point of view in the law school, and you needed the opposing point of view, the conservative point of view. So you could say it was a way that by championing debates, you could say that the Federalist Society smuggled conservatives in, except that the Federalist Society genuinely believed, as you suggested, in the value of hearing multiple sides of an issue and letting the best argument win. They genuinely believe that. And in doing so, they want a hearing for conservative voices. This would dramatize how far our universities, Professor Hankin's suggestion would dramatize how far our universities have deviated from what ought to be their mission by making the House of Representatives a place where you expect hard-hitting political debate, becoming the home to serious intellectual debate, because our university, among real intellectuals, among journalists, among professors, because universities aren't allowing that to happen. I love the idea.
Yeah, it's genius. I mean, I know that you follow and have been following what's happened on college campuses for some time, but even 3 decades ago when I was on a college campus, that was still, even as political correctness was present and speech codes were being imposed, you still had the Phyllis Schlafly and Sarah Weddington debates on college campuses around the country, and even some sort of spectacle-type debates, but that were still interesting, like G. Gordon Liddy and Timothy Leary doing college campus tours. You don't have any of that anymore. For one, as Professor Hankins points out, so many conservatives aren't even allowed on college campuses, much less to debate side by side. But it's not that far removed from a way that we used to understand what the campus was, and frankly, beyond the campus, that we used to understand what is interesting is credentialed people to some extent, through work product, not just meaningless credentials like a BA, but through work product, arguing on the merits, uninterrupted, on the issues of the day. And that's why, for gosh sakes, that's why Bill Buckley's Fireline program was on for 30 years.
I agree. And I even have a proposal to assist Professor Hankin. Here's an issue that the House should begin with. Let's debate the wisdom of the First Amendment. On campus, as you know, it's very popular to say that freedom of speech is harmful, needs to be limited. Freedom of speech causes damage to people and invalidates their humanity. But let's see outside of the universities people seriously taking the stand that the First Amendment is an unwise feature of our Constitution. And let's also hear the best arguments. People need to be reminded of the great achievement which the First Amendment represents.
Yeah, I like that. And also, too, I mean, so sticking with the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, I mean, you wrote recently about the state of journalism as it continues to deteriorate. And one of the things, speaking of Firing Line and NPR, is that it's sort of below the fold, because why would the D.C. press corps talk about it? You have a real consolidation of financing of private journalism from quasi-public entities. You have legislators proposing to formally fund private newspapers in places like Illinois. You have NPR buying the Chicago Sun-Times. They can use nonprofits, including at least partially taxpayer-funded nonprofits, to support news outlets that carry their point of view, even if they can't generate subscribers to allow those newspapers to exist independently.
Yes, there's reason to be deeply concerned about all of this. My own view is that which I believe is consistent with American constitutional government, is that the government needs to really get out of the business of regulating the expression of opinion in this country. I occasionally talk with students who remain, and understandably so, they're young, tempted by the idea that why shouldn't the government advance correct opinion? Wouldn't it be better for us to believe what's true than what's false? unfortunately, all historical experience taught us that the people who hold power are not responsible enough to have the authority to regulate opinion. So,
sure.
yes.
Yeah, so big government shouldn't be regulating big tech.
Yeah, I'm with you. They disgrace themselves in regard to COVID. We could start with just this one question, which I got to see up close and personal when I was in government. You may recall that in March or so of 2020, both Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, to whom I was a senior advisor at the time, and Senator Tom Cotton floated the possibility that COVID-19 had its origins in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. By the way, the only laboratory in all of China that engaged in research on coronaviruses like COVID-19. They were denounced as conspiracy theorists, and Facebook refused to allow that opinion, that speculation, to be expressed. Well, by now it's clear that the weight of opinion, certainly, I should say, opinion suggests that this is a very reasonable hypothesis. Evidence suggests this is a very reasonable hypothesis these days. I have colleagues close to it who have no doubt about the matter. Facebook regulated the expression of this opinion because they believe it violated, conflicted with a narrative that they wanted to press. They can't be trusted either.
Well, it's actually worse than that. We know from the Twitter files, and we know from Mark Zuckerberg's own utterances on the Joe Rogan show, is that they were collaborating with government to regulate speech. And so they're in service of the state. And that's a huge problem. And it seems to me it's just like this simple question. I mean, the idea, the hubris it takes to believe that one person or some group of people represent the oracle of truth. And so, you just wait for, you go up to the mountaintop to get the received wisdom from the oracle, and then the debate is over. I mean, that is the antithesis of living in a free society. That is the opposite of being a free, sentient being. And that's, I would think that used to be relatively obvious, but it is very much in doubt these days. And to the point of these debates, I think it'd be great. This needs to get to Kevin McCarthy and House Republican leadership somehow, some way.
I think you're right, and you in a way alluded to the greatest example of what you're talking about. Not only is it the antithesis of a free society, it's the antithesis of science. You remember when Dr. Fauci declared that to disagree with him is to disagree with the science. Mm-hmm. No proposition could be further removed from what science means. If science doesn't invite disagreement and challenge, because after all, way back when, all Senator Cotton and Secretary Pompeo were doing was saying, we need to investigate this possibility. Right. And by the way, we know from correspondence that the director of the Institute of Health, Francis Collins, and Fauci conspired to keep this view off the public record and censor it at Twitter and Facebook.
It's such a... Pompeo and Cotton were arguing for the scientific method, and the scientific community was arguing against it.
That's right, although it's very interesting. Initially, the scientific community did not, but eventually Fauci and Collins helped persuade the scientific community to side with them. But you'll recall that 3 of the world's most distinguished epidemiologists drafted something that was called the Great Barrington Declaration. Mm-hmm. Now, this did not take sides on the origins of COVID-19, but it did propose a response to the pandemic that differed from the one that had become accepted by the media and by social media. And they were routinely vilified by establishment science. That's not how science operates, not through vilification. It doesn't operate by refusing to consider the evidence. It operates by considering the evidence, testing the evidence, actually welcoming dissenters into the fold and saying, thank you for expressing an alternative point of view. Now we can test your views against our views.
Well, the other thing about this debate idea, too, is I don't know what your view is, but I don't, and I know you talked in your piece about what J schools could do if they wanted to renew any sobriety with respect to journalism, but they're not going to do that. And so I don't think change can come from the inside in these institutions. They're so monolithic in viewpoint. So I think something like House Republican sponsored debates, serious debates on the issues of the day, it's going to take exogenous events like that to get any of these institutions to change their ways, because there's no real impetus for them to do so.
I agree that that we cannot expect the universities to be the major source of their own reform. That said, we need to encourage all the small groups of students and beleaguered faculty who not only remain committed to the First Amendment. I think it's more than a small free amendment. I should say freedom of speech, because of course the First Amendment doesn't govern private universities. But not only is there a small minority who's willing to speak out, but there's a larger group, I think, that lacks the courage, but nevertheless is committed. So we should encourage action within the university, but we should also encourage private efforts, private educational undertakings. I'm involved in some of them in Washington. We should encourage more. And I want to circle back, as you have, to where you began. It's a terrific idea to use the Congress's oversight powers to conduct open debates on the issues and model for the nation what ought to be going on in our universities. Look, we need in the country such debates. And if universities won't fulfill their mission, actually do the thing for which we give them all sorts of tax breaks, then let the House of Representatives do it. And let us hope that the House of Representatives goes beyond shaming them to providing a model to which they could start living up.
He is Peter Berkowitz, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. You can find his writings at peterberkowitz.com. Peter, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Hi, Amy Jacobson here, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in our Food for the Poor campaign. Because of your generosity, guess what? We're able to feed 5,000 kids and counting in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, these are children and families that simply would not have food without your generous donations. But just because the holiday season is over,